I spoke to a few LSPs over the years in Canada talking about how typical it is to have a big team of linguists internally.
I just don't think you can quantifiably, mathematically rate language. And welcome to SlatorPod number 70. Hello, Esther.
Hello, Florian. How are you?
I'm okay. So today, people will have to make do with your two favorite hosts. Because, there's not going to be any guest today. We had a last minute emergency, or we didn't, but the guest did. So, business emergency. So, no worries. There's going to be an incredible guest next week. So stay tuned for that. But the next week is also going to be SlatorCon Remote. We got 200 plus participants, probably going to hit 200 to 300 at the end of it all. And agenda is now complete. So the good thing with these remote things is you don't really have to arrange any travel, do you? So I do expect, a few hundred last second signups here, because it's not like you have to travel anywhere.
True. Yeah.
Who has traveled anywhere? I mean, what I'm seeing is a lot of people in the US are starting to travel, and here not so much. But still, probably
people are doing staycations, I think, in the UK. So we're allowed to
inside
not inside. I mean, staying in the UK, so visiting other parts of the country.
It's good. You get to see your own country.
Some of the travel has opened up, so I think you are allowed to stay in accommodation, rented or hotel. Actually, not hotel. I think it has to be self-contained. So there is some like Airbnb type. But you can only go with people in your household or in your bubble. So it's when you've been locked down with them for 18 months, it's you can go on holiday with the same person that you've been living with.
I'm tempted to go into another COVID discussion, but
no,
no, it's just that we keep talking about COVID, and I keep being surprised about like what the severity of the UK lockdown. So, but okay, let's take this offline. So, not related to COVID is we have let me just go through a couple of the more recent announcements on the speaker side for SlatorCon Remote. So one is AI in localization. We got Darren Gobble, VP Solutions We Localize, and he's discussing this with Wayne Borland, Director of Translation at Dell. Dell,
cool.
Got a ton of translation localization going on. On the buyer presentation side, we got Valerie Petit, Senior Localization Manager at Korn Ferry. I used to know Korn Ferry primarily for the recruitment part. They were, they still are a really super senior level
headhunting type.
Yeah, headhunting. Like, you need a CEO, you go to them. But they also have a huge management consulting and management consulting practice as well. And so she's going to talk about localization at the Korn Ferry. And then we got Marianne Henselman, Senior Director of Translation Management Services at ADP, the giant payroll and HR services company. And she's going to talk about, I did get to see the initial slides, very, very interesting. Like the journey they got from a kind of internal localization startup all the way to like a really kind of sophisticated localization operation that they have now. And then Esther, you're going to moderate the e-commerce panel. Tell us more about that.
I am. Yeah, very exciting. We're going to be having a e-commerce panel, and we are excited to have Shopify, a representative from Shopify, Julia Greco, who is the localization programs lead, joining us on the panel. Also, the head of e-commerce marketing from Wix.com, that's Liat Karpel-Gerwitz. And we'll be joined by Yair Tal, who is the CEO of Blend Localization Services. And yes, me.
That's quite the panel. I mean, Shopify and Wix, those are two huge names.
Yeah.
Shopify kind of is e-commerce. It's nibbling at Amazon's heel there, making it all easier and kind of disintermediating all of that. So that's really cool panel. Again, just big shout out to our partners. We localize Blend and Lil, to make this all happen. And we do this on Hopin, this platform, which is improving by the minute because they got so much money because they raised $1 gazillion a few months back. So I do see the improvements being rolled out now on the back end as well. So The one thing that was, the whole one thing they should really put also some money is kind of making it more lightweight in the browser so it doesn't heat up.
Yeah.
But I think they're getting better, and it's been very stable. By the way, the story of this podcast tool, just to go off on a slight tangent here,
Riverside.
Riverside. So Lil's communication manager kind of gave me a heads up that this wasn't even around a year ago. So So I listened to a podcast with the founder of Riverside. It's a super interesting story. So initially it was like a debating tool for Dutch politicians, and they could debate online, and then I think. So basically, that's the reason why it's easy to dial people. Like people can watch this podcast on the back. They're not even participating. Anyway, so eventually they figured out hey, we got some traction with the recording part is the interesting part. And long story short, they got traction with the podcast community, kind of video podcasting, high quality video podcasting. And now they also raised money like everybody does these days, from kind of a sole VC. I forgot the name. Alexis Ohanian, I guess, some Silicon Valley VC. Who I think he had a company before. I drawing a blank on it. Anyway, that's the story of Riverside. It's a great podcast. It's called Growth Hackers, Indie Hackers. So if you're interested in kind of bootstrapping a business from zero, listen to the Indie Hackers podcast. Okay, not listening to Indie Hacker podcast is Appen, whose stock crashed today, and would try to tell you why. And then TRSB bought Anglocom. You're going to tell us a bit more about that. That's in Canada.
Yep.
Then Google's putting out more and more research on MT. So there's a paper that I found really interesting that Seema wrote about this week. And then it was this giant RFP in Sweden around interpreting. And then also our jobs index continues to climb and climb and climb. Apparently there's a lot of activity going on out there, as we spoke about. So Appen. Yeah.
Yeah, what happened with Appen?
Well, the stock crashed today, 20%.
Okay.
So today being Thursday, and the trading was halted. That's quite unusual. So it crashed about 20% today. And they halted trading. I saw some letters of that they basically had to explain what they think happened. And, spoiler alert, they didn't really know what happened. So one thing that was on today was that CEO Mark Bryan, who we had on SlatorCon San Francisco,
Brian.
He spoke at Brian. Yeah, sorry.
Brian like a donkey. That's what he told me how to say it.
Okay, good. Brian spoke at a conference hosted by the investment bank Macquarie, and he started with a financial update, but that was not different from what they already disclosed a couple of months ago. And again, just for context, so Appen is this data for AI, a data labeling company, which there's some overlap with the language industry. And we also have a panel at SlatorCon Remote around this, because a lot of LSPs are going into this space, which, may put some pressure on them as well, because that wasn't the case 5 years ago. So going back to this stock crash, so they disclosed, we're generating 600 million Aussie dollars in 2020. That was up 12% on the prior year. 108 million in earnings, in EBITDA earnings. That was up 8%. So that had all been out before. That was already out in December. So that wasn't the surprise. And so there's very few sources around what happened. So one Aussie newspaper speculated that it was kind of a response to generally tech stocks not doing so well in the US. But then I went over and looked at the NASDAQ, and it was down marginally, like 0.5% last night. So that can't be the reason. So it must have been something that during that CEO speak at the conference. And so we went into, they actually published all of his
transcript or something.
Yeah, the transcript, his speech, right? And so on the negatives, he just mentioned that COVID impacted their face-to-face selling, well, as it did for literally everyone on the planet. Then also said COVID interrupted some of the businesses last year, and that reduced the digital ad spend. And Appen is very exposed to their work with Google on search relevance, so helping to make the Google search more relevant to people. That doesn't seem like digital ad spend. They also mentioned that digital ad spend bounced back strongly, so that can't be the reason. And then they also said that some of the major customers, i.e. all of the big tech companies, are responding to data privacy and antitrust concerns. But again, that's nothing new, right? They did talk about also some positives. So they said, hey, we don't see any unusual pressure on pricing. We don't see a shift to insourcing, i.e. that like these big tech companies would start doing the data annotation internally. That would obviously be a bad thing for the vendors. They said there's no meaningful changes in AI development techniques, that, the customers continue to be in competition with each other, which is good because they need to make the product a lot better, of course. No systemic change to the demand for relevance data. And there's no change in generally the need for training data, as more and more companies are investing in AI and they all need training data. That's something I remember from John Fennelly's presentation back in London at SlatorCon. We're saying, hey, look, this is not just about big tech. There's thousands of other companies that require training data for AI. So this is a very...
Well, more and more as companies begin to pivot to AI as well.
Or use it, right? I mean, use it and use some type of AI in their operations. And so... So also, actually, Appen, he did for the first time mention Lionbridge as a competitor. So he also said that the competitive environment for relevance, these services, is unchanged with Appen and Lionbridge AI as the key providers. So I don't think I've ever heard Appen mention Lionbridge specifically as a key competitor.
Well, of course, it's owned by TELUS now, isn't it? Maybe that's what he was referring to in being unchanged by, well, partly, at least in part, by that acquisition.
Yeah. So again, we don't know. Let's see how the stock does tomorrow if it bounces back. But so far, that's pretty brutal. I think they're down 68% shares from the high last year. That's 2/3. So not good. If you invested $100, you're left with 33 at the moment. So probably should.
I'd be less worried if I'd invested 100 than if I'd invested significantly more.
Yeah, okay. Let's say if you invested $1 million, you're left with 200,000. We don't know how much TRSB invested in Anglocom, though, do we?
We do not. No. Good seg. Yes. So, Canadian LSP TRSB was one of the largest LSPs in Canada. They announced that they had acquired a local rival LSP called Anglocom, which is also based locally in Quebec. They didn't share, like you said, the purchase price or really any terms relating to the deal, but we did speak to their CEO, Mary Kazamias. So she told us that the two companies, TRSB and Anglocom, they had been in touch. They connected before the pandemic to talk about potential deal. So obviously, I mean, that's going back sort of a year, well, more than a year now that they would have first had communications around this, but it closed just in the end of April. So, yeah, TRSB actually, they took on some private equity investors. They announced a recapitalization agreement with an American private equity firm called HKW, actually just a few months prior to approaching Anglocom. This was in December 2019. And so TRSB is currently, well, shareholders include the original family owners, some of TRSB's management team, and also HKW. But we actually did speak to Mary back at the time that we wrote about the private equity deal. And she told us that they had or were becoming an active player in the buying M&A scene. So here we go. It's maybe not surprising that they've now completed an acquisition. On the Anglocom side, so Mary said that the two owners of Anglocom are going to be staying on with TRSB after the sales. That's Grant Hamilton, who's the president and founder of Anglocom, and also Gregory Avenet, who's the VP of operations. It's an interesting makeup in terms of the employees. And I think maybe typical of Canada, there's quite a lot of in-sourced translations. They've got a pretty large linguistic team making up about or more than 60% of the staff. she said, post-deal. So they've got 300 full-time employees and about 100, including roughly 180 linguists.
That's a lot. I mean, and
it's a lot.
That reminds me of my company previously, CLS. We acquired Lexitech, which was a similar size, about 300 people, and also probably half of them were linguists internally. And I know Versacom in Canada is similar size and similar setup in terms of internal linguists.
Yeah,
it's interesting that it's probably because it's predictable and a lot of French, English, French. And so it makes sense to maybe hire internals because lots of volume, similar, like same language combo. And at that scale, it makes more sense to have people in-house than to continue to kind of, fight for availability from freelancers, it looks like.
Yeah. I think it is quite typical, as you say, I spoke to a few LSPs over the years in Canada, talking about how typical it is to have, a big team of linguists internally in the Canada LSP landscape, which obviously makes it somewhat different from the industry standard model globally. But yes, Mary said that the in-house linguists at Anglocom were central to the acquisition. She said what they particularly liked about Anglocom was the fact that the translators are also very skilled at writing. So they're quite sort of crafty with writing, which makes them very suited for marketing materials and advertising, which is one of the key strengths of Anglocom. On the sort of size of the organization, you mentioned it's a similar size to Versacom TRSB. So TRSB prior to the deal generated about $25 million in 2020, but they grew pretty strongly. It was 14% on the previous year, despite COVID, which was pretty encouraging. And Mary said that that generally the market in Canada was quite healthy despite COVID, even in the last year. Versacom also that you mentioned was slightly larger in 2020, maybe not now, but they also grew 17%, and a number of the other Canadian LSPs grew to varying degrees. There was Oxo Group, Scriptis, and Lat Multilingual that are all on the Slator LSPI, and they all grew. So things faring pretty well in Canada.
Things are good in Canada.
I think that's always the case, isn't it? Things are always good in Canada.
Life
is good in Canada. I get the sense.
That's a quote for the ages. Hello, Canadian viewers and listeners. You don't know how good you have it over there.
You don't know. Yeah. I actually have no idea, but yeah.
I the only time I was in Canada was in Vancouver at my first and my Lock World Canada Vancouver when I was just thinking about doing Slator. That was like back in 2014. Great.
Well,
city.
You remember my trip to Canada, which was in February 2020 and lasted exactly less than 24 hours. When I went to ALIA conference in Ottawa.
Imagine flying somewhere.
That wasn't even my last trip prior to the pandemic, but it was definitely one of the last ones.
Yeah, that's probably never going to come back. Like, how could you ever justify, like, hey, why don't you fly? Well, I don't know. Depends, but this is going to be really hard to bring back. Like, people flying for business reasons for something like 24 hours. Google likes to put out papers on machine translation. They have a very active team. Authors include like Marcus Freitag, George Foster, Wolfgang Macrae are mentioned there. So this time we covered a paper called Experts, Errors, and Context, a large-scale study of human evaluation for machine translation. I also like how almost kind of clickbaity sometimes these academic paper titles are.
I know they're getting really creative with the titles. I like it.
It used to be a lot more boring, and now it's kind of, they probably have to make themselves heard. So the central problem here is that the entire academic community, it seems, is like struggling to evaluate their system really at scale and fairly. And in my view, I mean, I've spoken about this on the podcast many times before. I think this quality evaluation problem is kind of a clash between math and arts, right? So the math, computer science people, they just want to have a figure, they want to have a metric, something hard to kind of hold on to. But then they're doing it in the domain of language, which is anything but, objective and quantifiable. And so I find it interesting. I mean, how they are at all these attempts. I mean, this has been going on for literally decades, and they still haven't figured out like a standardized metric. We had just blue, but like, how relevant is it? How much sense does it actually make? And so what they've done now is, long story short here, they looked at a lot of these systems are evaluated in the past based on like crowd workers, right? To bring costs down. So you say, well, you used human evaluation, but actually what you did was you used crowd workers that not necessarily professional linguists, right? You want to keep costs down. Problem is, those crowd workers just have different preferences. They're less able to distinguish human translation from NT, especially as NT quality improves, and they prefer kind of more literal, quote unquote, easy to read translations, right? So what Google did now is they used professional translators, to rank systems, but also to come up with a new quality system, automatic metrics that are trained by professional translators, right? So long story short, it's actually, they found that it's better to have professional translators train a advanced system than having the kind of amateur crowd workers do this manually. So
that's good.
Is that clear so far?
Yeah. I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So they said that the author wrote that they wrote that noting that the automatic metrics trained on this MQM model and informed by professional translators, quote unquote, already outperform crowd worker human evaluation. Interesting. I mean, so why keep doing the crowd worker thing? I mean, it's you wouldn't do that in many other domains either. Just taking people that have no subject matter expertise.
Yeah, you want the experts to be the ones training the thing if you want it to improve over time.
Yeah. No, but it's the pros train the system, which is then automated, and it now outperforms the crowd workers doing it manually, not training a system, but actually doing the evaluation. Again, it's a conflict between math and arts. It won't get resolved ever. That's my take. That's one of the very few. I know I'm not an expert on machine translation evaluation, but I just don't think you can quantifiably, mathematically rate language. I mean, unless it's like super simple, but then what's the point? So, you can't really rate a novel either. Like, this is a great novel. The system said so. Anyways,
do you think it's all futile then, that they shouldn't bother, or do you think that there's benefit in attempting to, because it will lead to some kind of incremental gains anyway, even if it's not going to be perfect?
Probably what you just said. Yeah, I mean, it's helpful. It's indicative, directionally correct. So it has some utility, but like if they make it sound like it's like scientifically accurate, I mean, that's just part of my French, but that's just BS. Like, it's not. So no, because every translation, unless it's a super simple sentence, has like 50 possible versions,
variations.
So it's not possible. And I know you could kind of go down the rabbit hole here and really look at all of the metrics they're using, and I don't think it's a solvable problem. All right, Sweden, Stockholm, wants to get one single vendor for all of their interpreting.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and it's a big contract tender that has been launched in Sweden. So the estimated contract price is estimated at euro, 60 million euros, almost 59 million euros. In US dollars, 72 million, or in SEK, that is 600 million. And that's the total contract value over 4 years. So that roughly works out to around 15 million euros a year. So it's still a fairly sizable chunk of revenues for anybody to take on. The services, you said, it's an interpreting contract. The services include on-site, remote, and on-demand interpretation. So this includes interpreting services for the Swedish healthcare helpline. I suppose you dial up and ask for healthcare help, and you have an interpreter also on the line. The deadline for submissions is the May 21st, so a few weeks' time, just before midnight. And the target start date for the contract is not for another year until June 2022. It's a massive tender, and I'd be interested to get your take on this. But I mean, they are currently, I think they're working with 3 suppliers, they said. And the rationale behind sort of consolidating this with one supplier, they said in the tender, Stockholm, that it is most appropriate to procure a complete solution with one supplier who will be responsible for covering the interpretation needs of the entire Stockholm region.
Makes sense.
It makes sense. Yeah, it's a big task for anybody.
It's a big task, but I mean, the region, like if you look at it from think about it, if you're in the US, right? I mean, okay, it's like 2.4 million, people, region. I mean, why split that up further? I mean, you could maybe argue, okay, you probably shouldn't have one single vendor for all of California or something like that. But I mean, for Stockholm, well, why not? Makes sense. And I think they also have they have their Tolkportalen. They have like a digital solution, right? Where you can, people can get plugged in. I think it makes sense.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting stipulations and kind of the data points coming out of the tender was around remote interpreting. So one of the points that they stipulated was that the vendor should ensure that the proportion of remote interpreting should increase. So that's kind of one of the goals of the contract as well. And they also gave some figures around the breakdown of interpreting services that were used in 2020 in Sweden. So they said on-site interpreting was nearly wiped out. It plummeted by around 80% during the pandemic, perhaps, unsurprisingly. But the total volumes, the overall volumes that they were doing or ordering of interpreting remained high and fell by around 15% from 2019 to 2020. So it seems like obviously the remote interpreting was making up that shortfall.
That's interesting. I mean, you almost wonder, like, what was the remaining 20%? That's still a fair amount of in-person interpreting. I mean,
Oh, right, yeah. the stuff that you just really have to do in.
And it was Sweden, so they never really locked down like much of the rest of the world, right? So, yeah, lots of business. 1 happy vendor, 2 vendors that are not so happy that currently have that contract. Hey, so, okay, there was this one sponsored article, but it was really interesting by Translated. What are they doing? Like they're doing an ocean race?
Yeah, they're doing something incredibly ambitious, which I would say has nothing to do with localization and translation, but they are sort of bringing it back in a symbolic way to talk about translation, localization. But yeah, Translated, so the Italian or Italy-based LSP, has said that they're going to be participating in. It's called the Ocean Globe Race 2023. So this is a race in which a team travels in a boat around the world with no modern technology or equipment. So they're not allowed to use any modern navigation, no communication, so I guess no cell phones or anything, and no weather forecasting equipment will be allowed.
So, okay, hang on. So again, this is Translated. We had Isabel Andre on the podcast. Is Isabel going? Do we know?
I don't know if it said specifically, but they are recruiting people who might be interested in joining them on this voyage. They are looking, so they've kind of opened it up to people outside of Translated in the wider language industry. They've said that they're looking for, I think the total crew will be somewhere between 32 and 48 people in total, but they will do it in shifts. So the crew at any one time will be around 12 people, or 12 people, I think. So these people might sail up to 50 days without stopping and then hand over to the next team, the next crew. But they're going all over. So it starts in Europe. They are going to South Africa, they're going to Australia and New Zealand, and they're going to South America, and they will return to Europe in spring 2024. So I think they're estimating approximately 6 months or so. I don't know, to do that.
I mean, this would be hard even in a modern boat, but they're doing it without any modern technology and equipment and sailing?
Sailing, yeah. And it's in a vintage boat as well. So it's not, I don't think it's sort of latest spec. That they said they'll see sailors navigate vintage boats around the world. So they've also procured a boat. I think they've renamed it Translated 9, I believe.
What's the one something like, what's the one you have in Greenwich? The Cutty Sark?
Cutty Sark?
Yeah, something like that.
I mean, not quite of that size, I don't think, but big enough to hold 12 crew.
Yeah, but you want to be in a big... Okay, sorry, we're going off on a tangent here, but you want...
Not the size of the Cutty Sark, but
you want
if you're
but that makes me
interested
even
in the
more
sponsored
nervous.
article, there is I think there's an image of the boat, so you can go to the article and assess the boat for yourself.
Yeah, I'll assess the boat right now. Hang on. I mean,
okay, you do that.
Okay, vintage boat, Cutty Sark. Okay, I'd feel mildly comfortable,
not that vintage.
Yeah, but in a tiny boat.
It's not tiny either. I mean, it's a normal size for that many people.
Okay, this.
You got it.
But that doesn't look vintage. Maybe
I
semi-vintage.
think they refurbed it. They said something about it being. I think it's a pre-loved boat, so it's not brand new, but they might have refurbed it.
All right.
But anyway, shall we talk about why they're doing this? We can
please.
talk about some of their rationale. Well, they said. Translated said that, well, firstly, it's kind of the way we work here. No challenge is impossible. So they're up for a challenge. And symbolically, they were talking about that the regatta or the race represents how linguists connect people across cultures and across vast oceans.
Okay. Can I just pause you for a second? I mean,
yes.
Like when people say that in a kind of content marketing context.
Yeah.
All right, you say it. But I mean, here, it's not like you just say it. Like they're literally sailing around the world without modern equipment. So it's like, basically there's a lot of skin in this content marketing game here.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's a lot. It's a very ballsy move. But there was one other comment on it that I thought was quite interesting, where they were saying, they're a company that specializes in AI, obviously very focused on sort of cutting edge technology generally in operations. But they said we're taking part in an adventure where modern technology is not allowed. So they kind of thought that was, interesting. Also.
People are going to have like a 1 week iPhone detox or something. I mean, I'd have that. Imagine. Like you go from checking your phone 200 times a day. It's like, well, here's the ocean.
But I mean, they are looking for people to join. So if you're interested, Florian, I know you like a good sporting challenge.
Okay, bye. Guys.
Can you sacrifice some training time and 50 days at sea?
No. No, I just actually canceled a race that was upcoming in 4 weeks because I didn't have time to train for it. So
yeah.
Cool. Well, okay. So people, let me try to segue to this. So anybody coming back from 50 days out in the open ocean will likely find it somewhat easy to find a job. Because, Esther, why?
Well, because the job index keeps on climbing. That is the latest from the Slator Language Industry Job Index in May. We talked about this a lot on the podcast, but we use the job index as an indicator of hiring activity in the language industry. It was previously at an all-time high in April, just last month, but it grew again, I think by around 7 or 8 points to 139.41. So that's the growth since July 2018, which was the baseline of 100. So it's gone up around 40 points in nearly 2 years. But interesting, obviously, I mean, we spoke about that kind of sharp dip that happened around the onset of COVID last year as well, but it has been recovering pretty strongly ever since, as we've said. And just in the four months since the start of 2021, it's climbed a total of 31 points. So incredibly strong Q1. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of indicative of what we're seeing in the industry as well. Lots of funding, lots of M&A activity, LSPs publishing good sets of financial results or talking about really, really busy Q1s. Demand is high. Yeah.
Good stuff. And
What's
a lot
your
of people
thoughts?
are joining LockJobs. I think we had some, new companies joining. Then there's Canva posted jobs again. And we had MemSource, Translate Without Borders, Lingo24, and some others. It's cool. We have already 1,400 subscribers or whatever, followers, sorry, on LinkedIn for LockJobs. So that's cool.
Very nice.
Excellent. So, as we said before, no guest this week. So please make sure to head over to SlatorCon, register, and join us next Thursday in what's going to be like 4 hours of remote awesomeness. So see you there. Cheers. Bye.
See ya. Bye.